What's up, guys, and welcome back to Gabe Miller Music. This is my comparison between the Roland MC-101 and Verselab MV-1. These are two devices that could be seen as competing with each other. They've got pretty similar designs, similar workflows, and a lot of people would probably see the Verselab MV-1 as an upgrade from the MC-101. I'm going to get into that, do a super hands-on demonstration of both devices, their differences, their strengths and weaknesses, unique features, and workflows, which is super important. I should also briefly mention the MC-707. This was released at the same time as the MC-101 and is kind of the big sibling of that device. It gives you a lot more hands-on sound design features, but is more performance focused and is more expensive than either device. I haven't had a chance to try one, so I'm not going to be discussing that, but I do want to be clear that I don't think that the new Verselab MV-1 is a replacement for it. It's very much its own thing, with similar design and the same sound engine, but a very different approach to making music without a computer. I'm going to get into all that right now, so without any further introduction, let's jump into the devices. I'm going to start off by mentioning a bunch of the stuff that's exactly the same between these two devices, and I should note, I'm not necessarily trying to sway you one way or another in terms of what you end up getting. I just want to allow you to make an informed decision on whether to go with something less expensive and smaller and more compact, or something that costs a bit more and has a bit of a different approach. But these are both fantastic devices, and I want to get that out of the way first. So, stuff that these have in common. Both have the exact same sound engine. So that's the Zencore synth engine, which is the synth engine underpinning a lot of Roland gear at this point. It can do sleek, modern sounds, as well as some pretty authentic recreations of vintage sounds very well. It's super powerful, and there's also a plug-in version with a Roland Cloud membership that you can use to design sounds from scratch. You can get expansions for this stuff, and both have the exact same level of tweakability for sounds as well. So if I go into a synth track, I can choose from presets. Let me just choose a random one. I can then hit Shift Sound, go to Setting, and tweak a ton of parameters, such as the tuning, portamento, cutoff, ADSR, vibrato, all that kind of stuff. I can do the exact same thing on here, although I get to it a little bit differently. So let me choose a patch, and then I can go to the sections, go to the tone setting, and you have all the same settings in here. Same goes for effects. You can load one effect per track on both of these devices, and you can also send tracks to the reverb and delay. Effects include stuff like even more delays, distortion, choruses, flangers, phasers, all that kind of standard stuff, and some Roland specific stuff like a Juno chorus, which is nice to have. You can also deal with samples in a pretty similar way. You can map samples to a keyboard on both devices, and they can take on the characteristics of a synth track, including being able to be given portamento and cutoff and resonance and all that kind of stuff. That is the case on both of these devices, and you can arrange stuff into kits. So rather than a sample being pitched around with the pads, you've got a bunch of samples all occupying different pads, and that is just how the drum tracks on the 101 work. These are some custom drums. You can edit a ton of parameters related to these drums on a drum-by-drum basis on both devices as well. You can swap out samples either for built-in samples or stuff on your SD card that you've loaded in yourself, and you can just do that as WAV files. And you can control stuff like volume levels. Once again, a lot of these same effects are all here. You can really fit a lot on these kits, as they're called. Both have the exact same capability. Another similar capability is the fact that stuff is organized into clips, and clips can be up to 128 steps in length, aka 8 bars. They do work a little bit differently between these devices, though, and I will get into that, but they can hold the exact same amount of notes. You can have quite a bit of polyphony on both devices. Once again, the sound engine is the same between these two devices, and for that matter, there is quite a bit of workflow overlap, although there are some key differences that I'll get to in a second. The first kinds of differences I want to discuss are hardware differences. So first of all, this can be battery powered. You can feed this thing AA batteries. They will last quite a while with this thing, or you can bus power it via USB. You can also bus power this via USB. You just won't have things like phantom power, which is fine for people like me who aren't vocalists. And of course, you can actually plug this thing in with a wall adapter, but it does not have the ability to be like battery powered. It's not completely self-contained. In that regard, it's got to be plugged into something. Whereas this can run completely off of batteries, operate completely without anything other than a pair of headphones. Speaking of headphones, this is another interesting difference. This just has a headphone port. It's kind of hard to see, but this just has an 1/8 inch jack for a headphone, whereas this has both 1/4 inch and 1/8 inch, which I think is interesting. I've not really seen a lot of other devices that offer that. It is nice to have though, because if you've got some like proper studio headphones that you really want to monitor on and don't want to use like any kind of converter, you can totally do that. Or if you want to use this kind of on the go and just have some earbuds or more consumer grade headphones with you, once again, you can just roll with that. That's nice to have. Not a huge deal, but worth mentioning. Let's talk ins and outs. There are more ins and outs on this thing than on the MC-101, but not as many as you'd think. Of course, there's the stereo line in and out. That's the exact same on both devices. There is the mic in, which is only present on this. And there's line in, which is also only present on this. You can record into the MC-101, but you have to do so via USB. Both devices have SD card slots, MIDI in and out, USB 2.0 ports, and of course, your power adapter. I can quickly show you the stuff on the 101 as well. And note that I'm just running a single mono out for both of these because I'm not going to be doing an intense audio shootout here. Very similar in terms of what it does have, but of course it ditches the AC power adapter, no line ins or mic ins or any of that kind of stuff, but same amount of like audio outputs and exact same USB connectivity. This is getting back into similarities, but I should mention, speaking of USB, that both devices can send audio over USB into a DAW, including sending multi-track audio over USB. I've raved about that quite a bit on this channel because I really like the hybrid workflow of making an entire song on a self-contained device, recording a live jam, or in this case, a fully arranged song, into my computer, recording all the individual tracks in the process, and then mixing that in my DAW. That's a really nice way to get some proper polish out of a hardware device, kind of gets the best of both worlds. That's also why I'm not bummed about this not having more outputs than this does. This is meant to be like a machine that you can structure songs on. It's not really meant for live performance. And so having multi-track audio over USB is more than enough. Once again, I'll get into the differences in how you build up a song in these in a little bit. Another thing about build that I should mention, the screen. People hate this, and people comment to me about it like it's my fault. It's not my fault that I don't mind tiny screens. Although to be fair, if you are visually impaired, dealing with this would be incredibly frustrating, and I do not want to dismiss that. However, for a lot of people, this really shouldn't be a big deal. There is a lot packed into these things. Roland really likes their tiny screens, and for me, they're not a big deal. So I got used to this, and so for me, this, not a big deal. And they operate in the exact same way. Another obvious difference between the build of these two devices is the pads. These are fairly small. They have quite a bit of give to them. They're maybe not the most satisfying to play, but they're fine. They are perfectly adequate, and they're fairly quiet to play as well. These are obviously quite a bit bigger. They're much stiffer, and they have velocity sensitivity. To be honest, I typically turn that off. I'm typically making like electronic music or trap beats, and those typically have a lot of very regular note velocities. And if I want something to be a little more irregular, I might program it in, or I'll turn on the ability to have velocity on these. But that is really nice to have on here. That's something that's missing on here that a lot of people are bummed about. So it's definitely worth mentioning. And of course, here's the big difference. This guy's big and this guy isn't. This one really easily fits in a backpack. It's super portable, super easy to travel with. And because it's battery powered, it's just incredibly portable. That's really hard to beat. I am a sucker for a minimalist music production setup, and this is a lot of power packed into these 4 tracks. The size is an absolute pro for me. However, this is more of a like music production station, more of a studio, and that can be really nice, especially because not only do you have more tracks, but it leads to certain workflow improvements that are literally impossible on this thing. And let's get into that. Let's do a natty transition to workflow. The Roland workflow is a little menu divey, and there are pieces of it that are just ever so slightly counterintuitive, but once you get used to it, it's really not bad, and it is very possible to become very fast with either of these devices once you know your way around them. And there's some workflow differences that are just due to the different shapes of the devices that are not necessarily positive or negative, they're literally just different. I should mention though that this has more button per function buttons because there's just more space for more buttons. And there's a shift and an edit button, whereas this only has a shift button. So on this, you're often going to have a lot of combinations of shift and then another button, then maybe even another button. For instance, if I go into a synth track, go to the sequence for that, I've got my notes laid out on steps here. If I want to change one of these notes, there are a couple things I can do. For one thing, I can hit Shift Project to clear a step, or I can select a step, go back to a note, select that note, go back to sequence, and now it's living in there. That's fine. It's a bit of a back and forth dance that you have to do if you're programming notes in manually. So I'll typically just not even bother with that and record something in live, and then I will just either edit what I've played using these knobs. You can see different note data stored in here, or I'll use this back and forth to make modifications, or I will clear steps entirely. That's fine. Once you get into a rhythm of recording something and then clearing steps or just changing individual notes as necessary, it can be very fast to work with. However, this adds the step sequencer, which looks a little bit confusing if you're not used to step sequencers, but if you've used hardware drum machines or FL Studio, this is going to be fairly familiar to you. So here's how it works. Select a pad, select the step that pad goes on, and now that's living in there. I've already got some other stuff in here too, so let me just send that to a few steps. And there are more measures in this pattern, which is why that kit cut out. There's more living in here, and you can page through that. Basically the exact same on here, except there are only two in this case, and these light up accordingly. Very similar. You can also hold down a step and select an element to go on it. It cuts both ways, and then to clear a step, you just press it. That's a great workflow improvement that really takes advantage of this device's size that this thing just can't friggin' do. It's got a similar philosophy in that notes and drum hits and whatnot live on steps, and you control stuff on a step-by-step basis. That's the exact same, but how you do that is, I would say, more intuitive on this just because they have more space. And this is a kind of pads are the screen case for both of these. These have definitely taken cues from the Innovation Circuit in some of the UI design. In this case, you see the playhead moving forward. This patch was not meant to go with this bass line, by the way, which is why it sounds bad. Similar deal here. It'll follow this stuff. There's your playhead moving through, so on and so forth. Another aspect of workflow is how the tracks behave. And let's take a quick detour. A big obvious one is the fact that there are simply more tracks on this than there are on this. This has 4 tracks, and any of them can be melodic tracks, aka tone tracks, and those are essentially just synths, and you can have looper tracks, which can just hold a singular loop and then just play it over and over again. I have very little use for those and rarely use them. And there's the kit tracks, which can hold a bunch of different stuff. You can get a lot out of these 4 tracks, especially if you have all of your drums and percussion and maybe even a couple of melodic elements living on one kit track or one drum track. That leaves these 3 tracks free for whatever else you want, like say a bass line, a lead, and an ARP or a pad or something. And you can switch stuff out on a clip-by-clip basis, and I'll get into clips in a second. So that's all the same here, except you've just got more tracks to work with. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tracks that work like the tracks on here do, and then the vocals. I am not going to get into this super deep because this is not something I've messed with yet, but if you're a vocalist or an instrumentalist who wants to record in, say, a synth solo or just a synth part played live, you can record that into here. This is your 8th track, but in terms of tracks that are identical tracks on this, you got 7. Another thing I should mention is that these don't have to be drum tracks. They can be set to synth tracks, no problem. And I believe you could set anything to a kit as well if you wanted to. One thing I should note, these are stuck having note repeat on them. It's a really bad example. Whereas these melodic tracks are stuck having an arpeggiator if you go to style. weirdly slow arpeggiator, but you get the idea. But the chord engine will work on both. And I should mention both of these have built-in chord engines. So if you hit shift and chord on this, that exists on both of these, and both of these have, like I mentioned, the built-in arpeggiator and the ability to do note repeats. That's a lot of the same functionality. This has a slightly simpler arpeggiator, but still, they're very similar, but you access these differently. For one thing, you can actually record in note repeats live, whereas in this, you have to program it in after the fact. So all that being said, I got a little distracted, but this was all stuff that I intentionally wanted to cover. Having more tracks on this thing is super nice. Sometimes I will sacrifice this to be just a kick track, and you still got plenty of room to add stuff. And that is super freeing, especially when you get into arrangement. So let's spend some time on arrangement, because this is probably the key difference between these two devices, other than the increased track count and the smoother sequencing workflow. So let's talk about building a song. This is very much a live performance instrument. So you've got your clips. Each of them contain note data, instrument data, all that kind of stuff. And then you can launch different clips depending on what's happening. So let me reload this. You can only have one song at a time load on both of these devices, by the way. This clip is empty, by the way. That comes in right on beat. And I can even do that with larger musical sections. You can have combinations of clips stored in here for drastic changes happening all at once in your song. That's pretty standard for a groove box. You would launch clips on the fly, and that's how you build up a live jam. And you've got the scatter. And you can assign the scatter to go either to the entire mix or just to one track like I have it here. This device does not have scatter, which is unfortunate. That would be really fun to be able to play around with, but definitely not necessary. I used to dismiss scatter as a little bit of a gimmick until I realized how useful it was for things like fake tape stops, reverse effects, and octave jumps on individual tracks. It's not here. It's not that sorely missed, but it is good to know that this doesn't have that. So when building up a song, you would create a bunch of clips all living in here. You would launch them on the fly. And in your scenes, you would assign different clips to different scenes. And you can do that in whatever combination you want. So maybe this scene right here. Let's just say I have assigned blank clips other than the drums. Let me go to another clip. Let's say I have the main sample and I have the bass in here. Now I can launch them. I made a mistake somewhere. You get the idea. And you can like have the same clips assigned to multiple different scenes. You're recombining stuff, and then you can launch those whenever you want. That is pretty much the standard way that you would see a lot of groove boxes with a live performance oriented approach set up. That is not the case here. Clips here, a little bit weird. Once again, they work the same in terms of what they can store, but scenes, which contain combinations of clips, have been replaced by sections. And these also contain clips, but the clips are inextricably linked to the sections that they're a part of. So for instance, here's kind of a section of a song. Here's a different section of a song. Let's say I want to be in this section for a second and I change out this synth patch. Let's just actually do that real quick on the fly. And now, let me go back to section. See that little pad in the background? I just changed that from this. It didn't change it in here. And you can have sounds change on a clip-by-clip basis. That's nothing new. But if I go into sequence and go to section select, these are my clips. This clip is linked to this section. And so I can't just make a clip once and then assign it to a bunch of different sections. Every time I want to have a new section that has like the same musical patterns, I have to duplicate the clip. And if I want to say, have that new pad carry across the entire song, I have to copy this clip everywhere that it should appear. That's a little different. You can definitely get used to it, and there's not as much planning ahead going into that as you'd think. Like, you don't have to know exactly how you want to set stuff up in order to work within it, because you can just copy a clip from section to section, but clips do not operate independently of sections. They are linked, and there is absolutely no way that I can find to separate them, and trust me, I've looked. That does limit your flexibility a little bit, especially because you can only assign, say, things like effects on a clip-by-clip basis. Figuring out where the line between what goes on a clip and what goes on a track is also going to take some getting used to, although it really isn't too bad. Here's the benefit of that, though. Here's what that gains you. Song mode. You have your different sections. So, for instance, your little intro with bass line, intro with drums, section with more complex drums, so on and so forth. I've got all these sections of this song here. Now I can assign those sections to steps on the step sequencer, and you can see they're color coded here. So you just hit record, select a section of a song, and select the step that you want it to go on. And you can even control like how long that goes. So if you want it to repeat twice, you don't have to take up 2 steps. You can just control how many times it repeats. And you just assign all your song sections to the step sequencer, just straight linearly across time. And that's how you build up your song. And from there, you can either do a direct mixdown, so you can actually just export the song that you've laid out here as a WAV file, or I prefer to actually, once again, record them into a DAW and then mix the tracks after the fact. And that is another little difference worth noting. There is a dedicated mastering window here, so you can put a limiter on your master, for instance, which this, as far as I can tell, does not have. I should talk about mixing real quick. I almost wonder if this did it right and this did it wrong. I think it's just different approaches. These faders are fun. For live performance, it's fun to actually have a track turned down and then just turn it up. You know, it's like a mute, but with more steps. And they look cool, too. They make this thing feel like a little mixer, because it is a little mixer. This doesn't have that. This, you have to select your track and then use the knob to change the level and the panning and whatnot. There's also stuff for EQ, easily accessible, and stuff for delay and reverb sends, also easily accessible. With this, you have to do a little more menu diving to get to that on a track-by-track basis, but once again, not a huge deal. But yeah, you have to go track by track and like lock in your level, change track, change my level, change track, turn this up, so on and so forth. Whereas on here, you actually can do that, but once again, there's more menu diving. A lot of people are going to be setting levels just by these faders. And these faders can get messed up. Like if you turn the device off, throw it in your backpack, I'm probably just going to set all this stuff to neutral. So these are not nearly as useful as you might think, although they are much more tactile. This, once you set a volume, it's just good to go. You can change it at any time, of course, but you're not worrying about changing volumes because your faders got bumped for some reason. Once again, this thing's more live performance oriented. This thing is more like building a song oriented. There are a couple other little differences that I want to quickly mention that I didn't really have a place for anywhere else in the video. First of all, this has a feature called random patches or random tone tracks. I did an entire video on this. You can go to random and there's an algorithm that will kind of generate, kind of select a random patch. Not necessary, but really fun. This doesn't have that. I'm really not sure why it doesn't have that, but currently, as of the time I'm filming this, this does not have that. There's also the improved sampling ability of this device. It's definitely aimed more at beat makers than this is, although they're both fantastic for beat makers, to be clear. This can slice samples more effectively than this can, and this is something I haven't fully explored yet. I will probably do a video on it once I get my head around it. This can slice samples, but it's kind of convoluted, a little bit of a pain, but totally doable. This is definitely better for that. And finally, one other thing I wanted to mention, there's a bit of a difference in how these knobs work. You can assign stuff to these knobs, same with these, but these have like dedicated windows for like sound. That'll be something like tuning, filter is filter cutoff, there's the mod window, and then there's the effects window, which controls stuff like reverb send. Whereas with these, you actually assign these knobs to parameters. So it takes a little bit more setup, but once you've set them up, they behave fairly similarly. You know, they're endless encoder knobs, fairly straightforward. The difference that has in workflow is that you only have like 3 parameters that you can control at one time per track. Granted, each knob can control multiple parameters at once, but you can't like switch between them. Whereas the function that these knobs perform changes depending on just which window you have up, which is once again more geared for live performance. And then there's also the motion designer on both of these. That's fairly similar for creating automation. So to sum all that up, these are both fantastic devices by Roland. I really like what Roland has been doing in the Groovebox space lately, and I really hope that they continue to keep these devices updated and keep doing cool stuff in this world now that they've kind of returned to it. If you want extreme portability and even minimalism, the MC-101 is a good go-to. If you want more of like a studio on your table or on your lap even, the Verselab is a good one to go for. If you want more tracks, the Verselab's a no-brainer. When I saw the specs for this thing, when it was first announced, I was like, why are people not more thrilled about this? Because having this much Zen core on a hardware device is just lovely. If you are more oriented towards live performance and want to launch clips and do some live jamming, the MC-101 hands down is the device for that. It's built for that, whereas this has the song mode and is very much meant to be the DAW in a box experience, where you actually set up a song linearly and then that arrangement just stays there. You don't have to jam it out live. Just different approaches. One is not necessarily better than the other. I've enjoyed both quite a bit, and you can absolutely make full songs with both approaches. I will also say, if you are a beginner, I would tend to recommend the MC-101 a little more easily. For one thing, because it's less expensive, it's not as big, it's maybe even not as intimidating. You just have to memorize a few button combination commands to make your workflow faster, and you should be good to go. And of course, if you're a vocalist and you want the ultimate DAW in a box experience on that front as well, the Verselab is definitely the go-to. I should also say, if you want to do more hands-on sound design completely from scratch, neither of these devices have the edge over each other. The device that you would probably be more interested in is the MC-707, but that is also in a different price range from these. Like, that's the step beyond this one right here. But in terms of these two devices, this I would consider it to be an upgrade from the MC-101, but it intentionally loses some cool stuff that the 101 has as well. It is both an upgrade in terms of ins and outs, track count, and song mode, but also a lateral move in terms of approach. And that is the comparison. If you are still interested in looking further into the MV-1 and would like to see an unboxing and my initial process of learning it and my first impressions, you can click or tap up over here. I also make a beat from scratch in that video. And if you'd like to see a more in-depth review of the MC-101, you can click or tap down over here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.